In the autumn of 1843, two fur brigades left the same trading post on the upper Missouri within a few weeks of each other, both bound for the same rendezvous point, roughly 1,000 miles west, both carrying men, horses, and traps enough for a hard winter of work. The first brigade loaded down heavy and sensible, the way most folks today would still load down if you handed them the same problem. Sacks of flour, salt pork by the barrel, hardtack biscuit packed tight in crates, dried beans, coffee, a wagon, and a string of pack animals groaning under the weight of provisions meant to see a large party through months on the trail. The second brigade, smaller and traveling lighter by a wide margin, carried almost none of that. Each man's whole food supply for the journey fit into a pair of rawhide bags slung across his saddle, and inside those bags was a dark, dense, reddish-brown substance that did not look like food at all to most eyes, more like something you would use to patch a boot than something you would eat for 1,000 miles. The heavy brigade made it roughly halfway before real trouble started. Flour went damp and moldy in a string of wet weeks. The salt pork, eaten in quantity without much else alongside it, left men weak and short-tempered in a pattern any of you who watched my last video will recognize plain enough. Two pack animals gave out under the load before the halfway mark, and the food meant to feed them for months had to be rationed hard well before journey's end, because carrying that much weight had slowed the whole party down and stretched the trip out far longer than planned. They arrived at the rendezvous late, thin, and short two men who had turned back rather than risk the last hard stretch on failing supplies. The light brigade, traveling faster with far less weight to haul, made the full 1,000 miles in a fraction of the time, and every single man arrived in as good a condition as he left in, some of them by the old accounts, arriving heavier and stronger than when they set out, because the dark reddish substance in those rawhide bags was doing something no amount of flour and salt pork ever could. It was giving those men, in a package smaller than a loaf of bread, more usable strength than the other brigade was getting out of a wagon load of ordinary provisions, and it was doing it without spoiling, without needing a fire to cook it, without weighing a horse down, and without ever once running short, because a man could carry weeks of it in the space most travelers reserve for a few days of ordinary food. That is the myth I want to break apart for you tonight, friend. The myth that says survival on the move comes down to how much food you can carry, more sacks, more barrels, more variety, more weight on the pack animal. It is a reasonable sounding myth, and it is dead wrong. And the difference between those two brigades on that 1,000-mile trail proves it about as plainly as history ever proves anything. What that second brigade carried has a name, and it is one of the finest pieces of practical foodcraft this continent ever produced, refined over generations by peoples who had to move fast, travel light, and eat well doing it, or simply not survive the attempt. Tonight, I am going to hand you the whole of it, piece by piece, the way it was actually made, the reason it worked when heavier, more familiar food failed, and the plain, honest history of how this country largely forgot a food that once carried empires of fur traders across a continent in favor of food that costs more, weighs more, and does considerably less for you, pound for pound. Here is the twist, and I want you sitting with it before we go any further, because it is the whole spine of tonight. The heavy brigade did not fail because they packed poorly by the standards most of us would use today. They packed the way any sensible modern person would pack, heavy on bulk, heavy on familiar staples, heavy on the comfort of having plenty. What beat them was not cleverness or luck. It was two humble ingredients combined in the right proportion, understood by peoples who had solved the problem of moving fast and eating well across enormous distances long before any European ever set foot on this continent, and then carried forward by the fur trade because the men running that trade, hard practical businessmen with fortunes riding on getting brigades across country and back, learned fast which food actually worked and which food only felt like it ought to. I am Ezra Calhoun, and I have spent my whole life on a stretch of Ozark ground. My family has worked for the better part of 200 years, back in a hollow we still call Calhoun Hollow, tucked into the Missouri backcountry, where the hills fold up close, and a man learns early that what he carries matters every bit as much as where he is going. My grandfather Gideon raised me on that ground, and he was born in 1919 and lived to be 89 years old, and he made this exact food more times than either of us could count, off the back of a single hog or a good fall deer, the same way his own people had made it, going back further than anybody in the family could trace with certainty. He always said the same thing about it, plain and flat, that a man who understood this one recipe would never again be fooled into thinking survival was about how much he could pack. It was about how much good he could get out of what he packed, and those are two entirely different measures, and confusing them, he told me more than once, has starved and slowed more travelers across this continent than any single mistake in the whole history of moving across hard country. By the time we are through here tonight, you will understand exactly why that second brigade beat the first one so thoroughly, and it comes down to real hard nutritional facts that any modern kitchen scale and any modern understanding of calories can confirm plainly. You will know the two humble ingredients that made this food work and why almost nothing else on a frontier pantry shelf could match what those two things did together. You will know the plain, practical craft of making this food correctly, the ratios and the steps that separate a batch that lasts for years from a batch that spoils inside a month. You will know the mistake most people made when they tried to shortcut the process, a mistake that quietly ruined more batches of this food than any other single error. And you will know the last piece, the reason this dense, humble, endlessly practical food largely disappeared from American kitchens, even as this country's outdoor and survival industries grew into billion-dollar businesses, selling a far weaker, far more expensive substitute for the exact same idea. That is where we are headed tonight, piece by piece, and I am leaving nothing out. There are 6 pieces to understanding this food: what it is, why it worked when nothing else could match it, and how you could make a version of it yourself in your own kitchen for a fraction of what any outdoor store would charge you for something far inferior. 6 in order, and the order matters because each piece builds on the one before it. The first 2 pieces explain the plain nutritional problem this food solved, a problem most modern people have never had explained to them clearly. The middle pieces are the actual craft, the part you could put to use this very week if you wanted to. And the 6th piece, the last one, is the honest history of why this food faded from common use, and it is going to make you look at the shelf of expensive trail food at your local outdoor store with a different eye by the time we are through. The first piece is understanding the weight problem, because this is where the heavy brigade went wrong before they ever left the trading post, and it is where most modern people planning for any kind of extended self-sufficiency still go wrong today. Food, as most people think about it, is measured in variety and bulk, a little of this, a little of that, enough to feel well provisioned and comfortable. But a man traveling on foot or on horseback across real distance is not merely feeding himself. He is hauling every single ounce of that food the entire way, and weight on the trail is not a minor inconvenience. It is the single factor that determines how far a man can travel, how fast, and how much strength he has left to do real work once he arrives. A pound of food that gives a man very little usable energy for its weight is, in the plainest terms, a pound of dead weight he is dragging across the country for almost nothing in return. Consider what the heavy brigade was actually carrying, pound for pound. Flour is bulky, and worse, it is nearly useless on its own, requiring fuel, water, time, and proper conditions to turn into anything a man can eat, none of which are guaranteed on a hard trail in bad weather. Salt pork carries real calories, but eaten heavily and alone, without other food alongside it, it runs straight into the exact lean protein trouble I walked you through in an earlier piece we did together: more weight for less safe, usable strength than it appears to promise on the scale. Hardtack biscuit is dense and shelf-stable. Genuine credit where it is due, but it is almost entirely starch, offering steady but unspectacular energy, and very little of the dense, sustained fuel a hard-working body actually needs day after day on a long haul. Add it all together, and a heavy brigade provisioned the ordinary way was hauling an enormous weight of food that, ounce for ounce, delivered considerably less real strength to the men and animals carrying it than a much smaller, much lighter alternative could have delivered instead. This is the first piece, and it runs against the instinct most people carry into any kind of provisioning problem, which is that more food, more pounds, more variety equals more safety. It does not when weight itself is the enemy, and on any journey of real distance, weight is always the enemy, whether it is riding a horse down or slowing a man's own legs mile after mile. The question was never how much food a brigade could carry. It was how much usable strength they could carry, and those two numbers, weight and strength, are not the same measure at all. And confusing them is precisely what turned a well-intentioned, heavily provisioned brigade into the slower, weaker, hungrier of the two parties heading toward that same rendezvous. Here is your first thing to carry out of tonight, and I will give you one at the end of every piece. When you are thinking about food for any real journey or any real period of self-sufficiency, do not ask how much food you have. Ask how much usable energy you have per pound you are willing to carry or store, because those are entirely different questions. And the second one is the only question that actually matters once real distance or real scarcity enters the picture. Now, if bulk and variety are the wrong answer, what actually solves the weight problem? This brings me to the second piece, and it is the piece that explains in plain nutritional terms exactly what those two humble ingredients in the Light Brigade's rawhide bags were doing that nothing else on that heavy wagon could match. The second piece is understanding fat as the densest fuel available to the human body, and lean dried meat as the most weight efficient source of protein and long term shelf stability available on this continent, and understanding why combining the two in the right proportion produces a food that beats nearly anything else pound for pound. I touched on part of this ground in an earlier piece we did together about a different danger entirely, but it bears repeating here in full because it is the entire secret behind why this humble food worked as well as it did. Fat carries roughly twice the energy, pound for pound, that protein or carbohydrate carries. This is not folk wisdom. It is plain, measurable, settled nutritional science confirmed in any modern laboratory just as certainly as it would have been confirmed had anybody thought to measure it in a fur trade warehouse 200 years ago. A pound of pure rendered fat delivers roughly double the usable energy of a pound of flour or a pound of lean meat, which means that ounce for ounce fat is quite simply the most efficient fuel a traveling man can carry, the single best way to pack the maximum amount of strength into the minimum amount of weight on his saddle or his own back. But fat alone will not sustain a man properly across a long, hard journey. The body needs protein too, for the ordinary work of maintaining muscle and repairing the wear of hard travel. And this is where the second half of the equation comes in. Lean meat, dried thoroughly until nearly all the moisture is driven out of it, becomes remarkably light for the nutrition it still carries, because water, which makes up the majority of fresh meat's weight, is exactly what a traveling man does not need to haul across 1,000 miles of country. Properly dried lean meat, pounded down fine, takes up a fraction of the space and weight of the same meat fresh, while still carrying nearly all of its original protein. Combine the two, dried lean meat providing dense, lightweight protein, and rendered fat providing the most efficient fuel available, and you get a food that solves the weight problem from both directions at once. A pound of this combined food carried on a man's saddle delivers dramatically more usable strength than a pound of flour, a pound of salt pork eaten alone, or a pound of nearly anything else a heavy, conventionally provisioned brigade might have packed. That is why the Light Brigade, carrying what looked to any casual observer like almost nothing, actually out-provisioned the Heavy Brigade by a wide margin, because the measure that actually mattered was never the size of the load. It was the strength packed inside it. So here is your second thing to carry. The two most weight-efficient foods a traveling man can carry are dense fat for pure fuel and thoroughly dried lean protein for sustained strength, and combining the two rather than relying on either alone or on bulkier conventional staples is the single most efficient way ever devised on this continent to carry real sustained strength across real distance without dragging unnecessary weight along with it. Now, understanding why this combination works is only half the battle. Making it correctly so that it actually keeps for months or years rather than spoiling on the trail is its own careful craft, and getting it wrong is precisely what ruined more than a few well-intentioned attempts at this food across the generations. That is the third piece, and it is the piece you could actually put to use in your own kitchen this week. The third piece is the craft of making this food correctly, and I'm going to walk you through it plain, the way Gideon walked me through it standing at his own kitchen table more times than I could count. This food has a name, and I have held off using it until now on purpose because I wanted you to understand the reasoning behind it before you ever heard the word. The same way understanding why a rifle works matters more than simply knowing what to call it. This food is called Pemmican, and it stands as one of the most refined and battle-tested pieces of practical foodcraft ever developed on this continent, understood first by the native peoples of the northern plains and woodlands, who depended on it for exactly the kind of long, hard travel and lean season survival I have been describing all night, and adopted wholesale by the fur trade once European and American traders realized nothing else came close to matching it for moving large numbers of working men across enormous distances. The process begins with lean meat, and any lean meat will serve, though buffalo and deer were the traditional standards on the plains and in the eastern woodlands respectively. The meat is sliced thin against any natural fat and dried thoroughly, either in the sun in dry climates or over a low, steady fire in wetter country, until it is hard, brittle, and nearly free of moisture. This is the same drying process behind ordinary dried meat or jerky, which I will be walking you through in full detail before long, but for pemmican, the drying is only the first step rather than the finished product. Once the meat is dried hard, it is pounded, traditionally between two stones or in a hide bag with a heavy stone, until it breaks down into a coarse, fine powder, almost flour-like in texture, releasing every bit of that dense protein into a form that will mix evenly with what comes next. The fat is rendered separately, cut small, and melted down low and slow the same way I described in an earlier piece we did together, strained clean of any solid bits and kept warm and liquid rather than allowed to set firm before the next step. The traditional ratio, confirmed across generations of practical use and later recorded plainly in the fur trade's own careful accounts, ran roughly equal parts by weight, sometimes leaning slightly more toward fat than meat, because the makers understood, long before any laboratory confirmed it, that the fat was doing the heaviest lifting in terms of usable energy, and a batch too light on fat simply did not carry a man as far or as well as a batch made properly rich. The warm liquid fat is worked thoroughly into the pounded meat powder, kneaded and mixed until every bit of that dry meat is coated and saturated, and at this stage dried berries were very often worked in as well when they were available, adding a measure of natural sugar for quick energy alongside the steady, sustained fuel of the fat and protein, and adding a flavor that made the food considerably more pleasant to eat day after day across a long journey than plain meat and fat alone. The mixture, while still warm and workable, is pressed firmly into cakes or packed tightly into rawhide bags called parfleches, squeezing out any trapped air because air pockets are exactly where spoilage takes hold first, the same lesson that applies to nearly every method of food preservation the old-timers relied on. Once cooled and set, the fat solidifies around the meat powder, sealing it thoroughly and creating a dense, stable block that requires no cooking, no water, no fire, and no special handling to eat. A traveling man simply cut off a piece and ate it as it was, or when he had the time and inclination, boiled it into a thick filling stew, but the food itself asked nothing of him beyond a knife and an appetite, which is precisely why it suited hard travel so well, requiring none of the preparation, fuel, or delay that flour, dried beans, or nearly any other conventional trail provision demanded before it could feed a man properly. Here's your third thing to carry, and it is really the whole recipe distilled down to its essentials. Dry lean meat thoroughly and pound it to a coarse powder. Render fat clean and keep it warm and liquid. Work the fat thoroughly into the meat powder at roughly equal weight, leaning toward more fat rather than less. Add dried berries if you have them, and press the mixture tightly into a sealed block or bag, squeezing out every pocket of trapped air before it sets. That is pemmican, start to finish, and there is nothing in that process that requires equipment or ingredients unavailable to any household today with access to lean meat and a bit of patience. Let me walk you through a few of the finer points because the basic recipe is simple, but the details are where a good batch separates itself from a mediocre one. And these are the details Gideon drilled into me over years of standing beside him at the same kitchen table. The choice of meat mattered more than most modern folks would guess. Buffalo was the traditional standard on the Great Plains, prized for its particular leanness and the way it dried down hard and clean without turning brittle in the wrong way, but deer, elk, and even smaller game like rabbit, trimmed of every scrap of sinew, served the purpose well enough across the eastern woodlands and the southern hill country alike. And Gideon made his own batches most often off white-tailed deer, since that was what these Ozark hills reliably provided every autumn. Whatever the animal, the meat wanted trimming down hard before drying, every visible bit of fat and connective tissue cut away and set aside, because fat left in the drying meat itself, rather than rendered separately and added back in a controlled amount, tends to turn rancid inside the finished cake far sooner than fat handled properly through rendering. The slicing itself mattered too. Meat cut thick dried slowly and unevenly, often drying hard on the outside while staying stubbornly damp at the center, which is precisely the kind of hidden moisture that leads to the false shortcut I'm about to warn you against. Meat sliced thin, no thicker than a coin, against the grain rather than with it, dried faster, more evenly, and more completely. And a careful maker took the time to slice every piece to a consistent thinness rather than rushing the job with uneven cuts. In dry, sunny country, strips could be hung on racks in direct sun and finished drying inside a day or two. In the damper hill country, where my own family has always worked, a low, steady fire with plenty of smoke moving through the drying rack did the job instead, taking longer, sometimes the better part of a week, but finishing every bit as thoroughly and carrying the added benefit of a light, smoky flavor that made the finished pemmican considerably more pleasant to eat. The pounding, too, had its own small craft to it. Traditional makers worked the dried meat between two flat stones or inside a tough hide bag struck repeatedly with a smooth, heavy stone, breaking it down gradually rather than trying to crush it to powder in a single hard effort, because meat pounded too aggressively all at once tends to compact into clumps rather than breaking into the fine, even powder that mixes most thoroughly with the warm fat later. A patient maker worked the meat down in stages, checking the texture as he went, aiming for something close to coarse meal rather than either large chunks or an overly fine dust. Now, the fourth piece of craft worth naming here is the vessel itself, the parfleche or rawhide bag. The finished pemmican was traditionally packed and sealed inside. These bags were made from rawhide scraped clean and dried stiff rather than tanned soft, because a stiff rawhide container held its shape, resisted punctures and rough handling on a hard trail, and once the warm pemmican was packed in and allowed to cool and harden inside it, created a nearly airtight seal around the food that kept moisture and pests out for the whole length of a long journey. A modern maker without access to rawhide has plenty of good substitutes: tightly sealed jars, vacuum-sealed bags, or simple wax-coated paper wrapping tied off tight, but the underlying principle carries forward exactly the same regardless of the material. Keep air and moisture out completely, and the food inside will keep remarkably well for a remarkably long time. Now, even knowing this recipe plainly, there was one mistake that ruined more batches of pemmican across the generations than any other single error, and it is a mistake plenty of well-meaning people then and now still make on their very first attempt. The fourth piece is the false shortcut, and I am putting it here on purpose, the same as I always do, because it is the single most natural, most understandable wrong turn a person can take when attempting this recipe, and it has ruined more batches than any other error by a wide margin. Here is the false shortcut, laid out plain. A person making pemmican for the first time, eager to get the meat drying process over with quickly, or simply lacking the patience for a proper long, slow dry, pulls the meat off the fire or out of the sun before it is truly, thoroughly dried through, leaving a trace of residual moisture that feels dry enough to the touch and looks finished enough to the eye. That meat gets pounded into the mixture anyway because it seems close enough, and the batch gets sealed up and set aside, looking, smelling, and feeling exactly like a properly made batch right up until the day, weeks, or sometimes only days later that it does not. This is the wheel, the same shape of trap I have described to you in different clothing more than once now, because these traps across every different danger I have walked you through tend to wear a similar shape no matter what they are dressed in. The meat looks dry, the process feels complete, and the small remaining trace of moisture, invisible and easy to dismiss, sits sealed inside the fat, cut off from the air that might otherwise have finished drying it out, and instead becomes exactly the damp, warm, airless environment that spoilage organisms need to take hold. A batch of pemmican made with meat that was 95% dry rather than fully dry is not 95% as good as a properly made batch. It is a batch quietly rotting from the inside, sealed up and hidden by the very fat that was supposed to be preserving it. And a traveling man who trusted that batch on a long journey could find himself, weeks into a trip, relying on food that had silently turned against him. The old-timers understood this danger plainly, even without the science to fully explain the mechanism, and they built their entire drying process around eliminating any margin for doubt. Meat for pemmican was not dried until it looked reasonably dry. It was dried until it was genuinely brittle, until a piece would snap cleanly rather than bend, until there was no question whatsoever, by touch, by sound, and by sight, that every trace of moisture had been driven out completely. This took patience, often several full days of careful attention rather than a single afternoon, and the makers who rushed this step, then as now, paid for that impatience later, on the trail at the worst possible moment to discover a batch had gone bad. Here is your fourth thing to carry, and it is the simplest rule in this whole piece, though it demands real patience to follow properly. When drying meat for pemmican, dry it until it is genuinely, completely brittle, snapping rather than bending, with no softness or gave left anywhere in the piece, and if you have any doubt at all about whether a piece is fully dry it longer rather than trusting your first impression. A few extra hours of patience at this stage is a small price against the alternative, which is a batch that fails you exactly when you can least afford it to. Now, beyond simply avoiding this mistake, there's a real practical craft to making pemmican that keeps not merely for weeks, but genuinely for years, and understanding that craft in full is the fifth piece. The fifth piece is the deliberate practice of making pemmican that lasts, and it comes down to 4 disciplined habits layered on top of the basic recipe I already gave you, each one addressing a different way spoilage could otherwise creep into an otherwise well-made batch. Start with the fat itself, because not all rendered fat keeps equally well, and the old-timers understood this distinction plainly. Fat rendered from around the organs and the back of an animal, sometimes called leaf fat or back fat, renders cleaner and keeps considerably longer than fat rendered from other parts of the carcass, because it carries fewer impurities that can turn rancid over time. A careful maker selected the cleanest, purest fat available specifically for pemmican, meant to last a long while, saving lesser cuts of fat for more immediate cooking needs rather than long-term storage, understanding that the quality of the fat going into a batch directly determined how many months or years that batch would remain good to eat. Second, the rendering itself had to be done low and slow, never at a hard boil, because fat scorched or overheated during rendering breaks down chemically in ways that shorten its storage life considerably, developing off flavors and turning rancid far sooner than fat rendered gently and patiently. This is the same lesson I've given you before about rendering fat properly, and it applies here with even more weight, because pemmican meant to last years cannot afford even a small head start towards spoilage baked into it from a rushed rendering process. Third, the finished cakes or packed bags were kept, whenever possible, in a cool, dry place, away from direct sun and away from any significant swings in temperature, because heat accelerates the slow chemical breakdown of fat over time, even in a properly made batch, while a cool, stable storage spot could stretch a good batch's usable life dramatically. The old trading posts kept their pemmican stores in cool cellar rooms or shaded storehouses for exactly this reason, understanding that storage conditions mattered nearly as much as the making itself. Fourth, and this ties the whole practice together, a properly made batch of pemmican was checked periodically rather than simply packed away and forgotten, opened and examined by smell and appearance every so often, particularly before a long journey where the traveler's life might depend on that food staying good. A rancid or spoiled patch caught early could be cut away and discarded while the rest of a large batch remained perfectly sound, a small ongoing act of care that meant the difference between trusting your food supply on a hard trail and discovering too late that it had failed you. So here is your fifth thing to carry, and it is 4 practices braided into one. Same as always. Choose the cleanest, purest fat available, particularly leaf fat and back fat, for any batch meant to last a long while. Render that fat low and slow, never at a hard boil, to avoid baking in an early start toward rancidity. Store the finished pemmican somewhere cool, dry, and stable, away from direct sun and temperature swings, and check stored batches periodically, cutting away any small spoiled patch before it can spread, rather than simply trusting a sealed batch to keep itself indefinitely without ever looking. I want to give you a real sense of just how long a properly made batch can last, because the numbers here genuinely surprise most people the first time they hear them plainly. The old fur trade posts routinely stocked pemmican meant to sit in storage for a year or longer before it was ever issued out to a brigade, and the trading company's own careful records kept the same disciplined way they kept every account of goods moving through their posts, describe batches remaining perfectly sound after 2 full years in proper storage, and there are accounts treated with real respect by the men who wrote them down at the time of pemmican still entirely edible after considerably longer than that, provided it had been made correctly from the start and kept in reasonably cool, dry conditions the whole while. Compare that to almost any other food a frontier household might have put up for the winter, and pemmican stands apart plainly as the single longest-keeping food available to people who had no ice, no refrigeration, and no sealed cans, relying entirely on the plain chemistry of dried protein locked inside clean, properly rendered fat. Gideon kept a small store of his own pemmican year-round, not because our family was ever truly cut off from a grocery store, the way a fur trapper 1,000 miles from the nearest post once was, but because he considered it good, ordinary insurance, the same way a careful man keeps a spare tire in his truck he hopes he never needs. He would make a fresh batch most falls off whatever deer the season provided, and he taught me to keep a small wax-marked note pressed into the top of each stored cake, noting the month and year it was made, a simple habit that let him rotate his stores properly, always working through the oldest batch first and replacing it with the newest, rather than losing track of what had been sitting on the shelf longest. It is a small piece of discipline, hardly worth calling a technique at all. And yet it is exactly the kind of small, unglamorous habit that separates a family who actually trusts their stored food in a real pinch from a family who simply hopes for the best. That is the craft, the full practice that turned a simple recipe of dried meat and fat into a food that genuinely kept for years and carried brigades 1,000 miles across country that would have broken a party relying on ordinary provisions. Now, here's another pattern break, friend, because we are at the edge of the last piece, and I want you square with me before we step over it. Everything so far, the weight problem, the fat and protein solution, the making of it, the false shortcut, the careful practices that made it last, is knowledge the old-timers and the fur trade both understood plainly, tested hard against real distance and real stakes over generations. What comes next is the honest history of why this humble, efficient, endlessly practical food largely disappeared from common American use, and it is a history that is going to change how you look at the shelf of expensive trail food at your local outdoor store. The sixth piece, the last piece, is the plain economic history of how this country's food industry gradually buried a food that once carried empires of fur traders across a continent, replacing it not with something better, but with something considerably more profitable to sell. Pemmican was, by its very nature, a food that cost a maker almost nothing beyond the meat and fat he already had on hand, the byproduct of an animal he had already taken for other purposes, combined with his own labor and patience rather than any purchased ingredient. There was very little for anyone to sell a family that already knew how to make it, because the whole point of the food was that it required nothing beyond what a household or a trading post already possessed. This made it, from a purely commercial standpoint, a poor product for any growing food industry to build a business around. And as this country industrialized through the latter half of the 1800s and into the 20th century, the food industry that emerged did not grow up around foods like pemmican. It grew up around foods that required purchased ingredients, specialized processing, and repeat buying, canned goods, packaged crackers and biscuits, and eventually the endless aisle of shelf-stable modern products that fill grocery stores today. The fur trade itself, the institution that had refined and relied on pemmican for generations, declined sharply through the latter half of the 1800s as the beaver trade collapsed and the plains buffalo herds that had supplied so much of the traditional pemmican trade were hunted to near extinction within a few short decades. With the trade that had institutionalized pemmican gone, and with a growing industrializing food economy that had little commercial interest in a food nobody needed to buy ingredients for, the knowledge of how to make it properly receded out of common practice, kept alive mostly in individual families and communities with a direct connection to the older frontier ways, families like my own, rather than remaining a widely taught, commonly practiced skill the way it had been for generations before. In the modern day, this gap got filled by an entire industry built around selling travelers exactly the kind of dense, portable, high-calorie food that pemmican once provided essentially for free, except now packaged, branded, and priced at a considerable markup. Modern energy bars and freeze-dried trail meals, examined honestly against the plain nutritional math I walked you through earlier tonight, very often deliver meaningfully less usable energy per ounce than a properly made batch of pemmican does, while costing many times more per pound than the cost of the lean meat and fat a family might already have on hand from their own hunting or their own kitchen. Walk into any outdoor supply store today and look honestly at what fills the trail food section. A small foil packet promising a quick burst of energy, built mostly from sugar and a modest helping of processed fat, priced at several dollars for an ounce or two of product that a hard-working man would burn through in less than an hour of real exertion. A freeze-dried meal in a pouch requiring boiling water and a stove to prepare, weighing surprisingly little dry but delivering, once you work the actual numbers, a caloric density nowhere near what a simple block of meat and rendered fat delivers pound for pound, and priced high enough that provisioning a week-long trip this way runs into real money fast. None of this is a scandal or a scheme, friend, and I want to say that plainly because these companies are not doing anything dishonest. They are selling a genuinely convenient, genuinely shelf-stable, genuinely well-marketed product, and convenience has real value that I am not here to argue against. But convenience is a different thing entirely from efficiency, and a family that understands the plain difference between the two can decide for themselves which one they are actually paying for every time they reach for a package off that shelf instead of a batch of something they could make at home for a fraction of the cost, using ingredients they may very well already have sitting in a freezer or a stock pot. Here is the honest arithmetic of it, laid out as plain as I can make it. A pound of lean meat and a pound of rendered fat, the raw materials for a hearty batch of pemmican, cost a hunting family essentially nothing beyond the processing already involved in putting up their own game for the season, or bought at an ordinary grocery store, run to a modest sum well within reach of most household budgets. A comparable pound of energy in modern packaged trail food, purchased ounce by expensive ounce off a specialty shelf, runs many times higher, sometimes by a factor most folks would find genuinely surprising if they sat down and worked the actual numbers rather than simply trusting the bright packaging and the confident marketing copy. That gap, multiplied across a season of hunting trips, a year of unpredictable weather, or a genuine emergency where a family needs to feed itself efficiently without a grocery run, adds up to a meaningful difference, one that the old-timers working with nothing but their own hands and whatever the land gave them would have found almost bewildering. A whole industry built around selling, at a steep premium, a considerably weaker version of a food their own grandmothers made for free. This is not a conspiracy, friend, and I want to be as careful and honest with you about that as Gideon always was with me. Nobody sat in a boardroom scheming to make people forget pemmican. It happened the plain, ordinary way most of these old skills fade, through an industry that grew up around products it could profitably sell rather than around a food that required no purchase at all, and a public that, having lost the direct connection to the old fur trade and the old ways, simply had no obvious reason to learn a skill nobody around them was practicing anymore. So that is the sixth piece, the buried heart of the whole thing. Pemmican did not disappear because something better replaced it. It disappeared because the economics of an industrializing food system had little use for a food that cost a family almost nothing to make and asked nothing of them beyond ingredients they likely already possessed. Every ounce of modern trail food sold at a premium today is in its own way standing in the empty space this humble old recipe used to fill, at a fraction of the efficiency and a considerable multiple of the price. Let me hand you the whole of it back together now, the way it ought to sit in your mind after tonight. Weight, not bulk or variety, is the true enemy on any real journey, and the food that wins is the food that delivers the most usable strength for the least weight carried, not the food that feels the most reassuringly plentiful in the moment. Fat is the densest fuel available, and thoroughly dried lean meat is the most weight-efficient source of lasting protein, and combining the two at roughly equal weight work together, while the fat is still warm and liquid, produces a food that beats nearly anything else pound for pound. The false shortcut that ruins more batches than any other mistake is drying the meat only part way before trusting it into the mixture. And the fix is simple patience, drying meat until it is genuinely brittle with no doubt remaining. Making a batch that lasts for years rather than weeks comes down to choosing clean fat, rendering it low and slow, storing the finished food cool and stable, and checking it periodically rather than trusting it blindly. And underneath all of it sits the honest reason this food faded from common use, which is that an industrializing food economy had no profitable place for a food nobody needed to keep buying ingredients for, and filled that gap instead with considerably more expensive and considerably less efficient modern substitutes. This was never really a story about two fur brigades, friend, though the story is true as far as the old accounts record it. It was about the difference between a food that looks like plenty and a food that actually delivers plenty, and that difference is exactly what let one brigade arrive stronger than they left, while another arrived late, thin, and two men short. If you ever find yourself needing to travel far, work hard, or simply store food efficiently against a lean season, you will not automatically reach for bulk and variety the way most people still do without ever hearing this. You will know to ask what actually delivers strength per pound, and you will know how to make, with your own hands and whatever lean meat and fat you already have on hand, a food that has carried people across this continent for longer than this country has existed, That is not survivalism talk, and it is not doom talk. That is the same ordinary practical competence your great-grandparents carried in their own kitchens without a second thought. Competence that got quietly priced out of the modern conversation about food and that you just picked back up again tonight. You do not need to make a full batch this week, friend, though I would encourage you to try it before the season turns. Do one thing. The next time you have lean meat on hand, from your own hunting, from a good sale at the store, or simply from your regular cooking, save the trim fat rather than discarding it, render it clean and low, and set it aside. That single habit, saving and rendering fat rather than throwing it away, is the first real step toward making a proper batch of pemmican whenever you are ready, and it costs you nothing but a bit of attention you are likely going to spend in the kitchen anyway. If you do decide to make a first batch, keep it modest. A small trial run, using no more than a pound or two of meat, teaches you the feel of the process, the right texture for the dried meat, the correct consistency of the warm fat, and the proper way to work the two together without risking a large quantity of good meat on a first attempt where mistakes are likely and entirely forgivable. Taste it plain on its own before you judge it against anything else, because pemmican eaten straight is a different experience than the modern palate expects, dense, rich, faintly smoky if you dried the meat over a fire, and entirely unlike the sweetened, flavored trail food most people are used to today. Some families work in a bit of honey or extra dried fruit to suit modern taste better, and there is no shame in that at all, provided the core ratio of lean meat to clean fat stays sound, because that ratio, more than any flavoring, is what actually determines whether the food does its job. Your grandfather likely knew how to make this one way or another, whether he called it pemmican or simply called it good sense in lean times. Somebody just did not get the chance to hand it down to you the way Gideon handed it down to me. Tell me down below, neighbor, did your own family ever make anything like this? A dense trail food carried on hunting trips or long journeys, made from meat and fat rather than anything bought at a store? Did an older relative ever tell you to save your fat rather than pour it down the drain without ever quite explaining the old reason behind it? Different families carried this practice under different names if they carried it at all, and the story that gets the most of you talking down there is the one I go deepest on next. And before you go, one more thing, because it is entirely different ground than anything we have covered so far, and it deserves your full attention. Next time, we're going after the gun mistake that got more frontiersmen killed than any ambush ever did, a plain, ordinary habit around firearms that every frontier family understood as a matter of daily discipline, and that a great many folks handling firearms today have never once been taught, right up until the one moment it cost them everything. If you want that one, and I expect you will, tap subscribe, because we are pulling these old buried pieces of knowing back into the light one at a time, and there are more of you finding your way here every week, and that matters a great deal more than you might think. Done by hand, told straight.